Hello everyone and welcome to Documentation Not Included. It's Thursday at 7 PM GMT and we are live on twitch.tv/DNI stream. It's time for episode 1.3, 12 file configuration blues. Sorry for the bad title, bad pun. My fault this week. I am Chris Seabock, as most people who watch the show will know, and unfortunately Josie cannot be with us today, but we are joined by a new guest, Steve Collins. So hello Steve, can you please tell everybody... Everyone. Tell everybody what you do, what you and what we're here for.
Okay, I'm Steve Collins. I'm a contract developer architect. Been contracting for 12 years now. Been working professionally for 25 years, but started back in the 80s writing code on the ZX Spectrum. So yeah, I show my age now. It's the grey beard. So yeah, just lately I've been going to various .NET user groups and talking about configuration.
Right, so and that is the title of today's show. Yeah. So as always, a big hello to everybody in chat. There's a little bit of stuff going on in Twitch already. Please do get involved in the show. It is live. We do field questions, and if there's anything that's relevant, we will read them out and answer them if they are part of the subject that we've got on today. So before we get going, we have an icebreaker question. This is something that Josie insists on having in the show, and it's basically something that allows us to get to know our guests and us a little bit. I have very quickly prepared one today because, as you see, Josie isn't here and she normally does it. So, Steve, if you could start a charity, what would it be and why?
Oh, gosh. I think it'd probably be something to do with homelessness.
Okay.
We're a first world country and we shouldn't be in the state that we're in with homelessness around the country. So I think it'd be something to do with that.
Very weirdly, that my wife came home from the park. She goes for a walk around the park every day, my wife at the moment. And she came home from the park and just randomly she saw two homeless people at the front of the park. We're in a sleepy town, it's not a busy place. And she said to me, I just went to the shop up the road and got some soup and a sandwich. And it was something out of the bank. My wife's a kind person, but I just didn't expect her to say that, and it was, it's like these people were they were blatantly homeless. They weren't the ones that you see begging in town centres occasionally that probably aren't homeless sometimes. But I agree. I think it is a problem that needs to be sorted. But anyway, I would probably have an animal charity because I'm not into humans. I don't do humans. Everyone, again, people who listen to the show know that I'm very into guinea pigs as well because my wife's a big fan of guinea pigs and we're involved in a local charity. But I'd love to have a sanctuary of some sort. There's some places I've been in America that have exotic animal sanctuaries where they've rescued exotic animals from people who've got them without actually considering the benefits of them. So I'd love to do that kind of thing. I'm very much into that. Okay, so before we get we've done our icebreaker. So onto the show. In fact, this show is called 12 File Configuration Blues, and what we're going to do is talk about configuration in applications. Probably going to bleed into a few other areas as well, but both Steve and I are .NET developers. We're both, by the sounds of it, in similar boats. I do architectural stuff as well. So we're probably going to get quite deep, I imagine. And in the show, normally we don't get that geeky. It's a geeky show. It's a software development show. But most of the things that we talk about are like business processes and, how to improve teams and, how to run a business as a contractor or freelancer. So it's really nice to get back down to our roots and start talking about something geeky. So let's start with a question. All right.
Go on then.
So why do developers use configuration files historically?
Okay. I think it comes down to four main reasons, really. Values that you're going to change in the future, so you don't want to hard bake them into your source code. Values that may differ between different environments. So you've got your dev connection strings, test connection strings, production connection strings, things like that. Something that's come about more over the last few years is feature switches. So you want to turn certain things on or off. And most important for me, and I know this is one that Josie was really keen on, sensitive values that should not be in source control.
Absolutely. API keys and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Connection strings with usernames and passwords to SQL Server.
So,
Nice.
I wanna just before we move on, I want to explore that a little bit. I want to explore
Okay.
the security side of things.
Yeah.
So historically, we've had, I mean, we've probably both seen lots of hard-coded values, strings in
Yeah.
the code that shouldn't be there for any reason whatsoever, and sometimes that's done because of legacy. Sometimes it's done because of ignorance, or sometimes it's done because of laziness.
Yeah.
I have seen quite a few times. Let me phrase this a different way as a question. What is the better way to store sensitive values then? If you need to change, have an API key in the source code where you're calling an external API, what's a better way to handle that?
Okay, so now we're going to sort of drill down into .NET world, which is my comfort zone. So especially in .NET Core. So one of the things you can do is .NET Core supports key vaults. So you've got a key vault in Azure, there's a key vault in AWS, HashiCorp have got a key vault as well. So those are up in the cloud. They've either got software or hardware encryption. So you can put your keys in there, you get a nice little dashboard, put them all in, and then you can call out to them. They're encrypted down the line to your application. And it's only once they're in your application that they become decrypted and you can use them. So that way they don't touch your source control at all. The other ways you can do it is in .NET Core. Microsoft have got WiseSys now, and you've now got a user secrets that you can do.
Sorry, say that. They've got what? Sorry?
User secrets.
No, before that. Microsoft have what? Sorry.
Got wise to it.
Oh, wise to it. I thought it was a new term I hadn't heard of. just misheard you.
No, they have got wise to the situation. So they've got user secrets. So you can right-click on your .NET Core project and say Add User Secrets. That gives a GUID inside your project file. And what that does is that used to go to a folder within your profile in Windows or in Linux or on Mac. And there you've got a folder that's got the same GUID, and you can have a JSON file and you can put them in there. So you've got access to them on your developer machine, but they don't go to source control. So that way you can fiddle them out to your heart's content as a developer, not committing anything.
So what about when we are creating a CI system then, or a CD system, and we need to be able to deploy different versions of the application into these environments that you mentioned earlier?
Okay.
What is the better? Because that having a key on my machine isn't particularly relevant then.
No.
That's just for me as a developer.
So in those, certainly if you're using Azure DevOps, what used to be Visual Studio Team Services, in their build system, you can have a vault of your secrets up in your CD system. So again, that sort of gets injected. The way it can do it is also via things like environmental variables and command line switches. So that way you can have, say you've got a deployment environment, you can go and set your environment variables outside and just roll your code out. And as long as your code is looking for environmental variables, it'll find them. Doesn't touch source control, doesn't touch your CD or CI system.
Your answers are all correct.
Thank you. Do I get a prize?
The reason I ask that is because a lot of the time developers struggle with this. It is something that, especially like the junior developers, they'll sometimes struggle with. Well, I just need this value, and it needs to. What do I do with it? And they don't really realize how damaging it can be putting your variables, even in a config file, because we're talking about config files here. But if we have we've separated the API key, we've put it into a config file variable, and then we push it to the source code, that's the source control, we immediately have security vulnerabilities there. We also have potential problems with developers, other developers accessing systems that they shouldn't access. There may very well be an integration test that's been written that uses that API key, and that API key may not have been, it could be on it could be a production API key or something like that. So removing those things and removing that responsibility from developers is key and really important, especially in big enterprise systems. So yeah, I mean, I've very recently done quite a lot of work with Docker, and that uses almost everything these days uses configuration files very heavily. Environment. There's actually about 3 or 4 different ways in Docker to inject your variables into there.
Yeah, so you've got Docker secrets as well.
Yeah, Docker secrets, and then there's things like Octopus, where it's very similar kind of concept to Visual Studio Online, which is Azure DevOps, whatever it's called these days.
The client I'm working with at the moment, we do that. We set it all up within Octopus. And what we do is we just use a transformation that sort of says curly brackets, go and replace that curly bracket with this value. But the downside to that is you've still got your secrets exposed
on the server
file system, but we'll move on to that in a minute.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually going to be my next point there with what I currently do with one of my it's actually the DNI website. We actually have a Docker setup for that. It's a simple website, but because we're geeks and because we kind of want to play with it, I push all of the Docker configuration. It's in our open source repository on GitHub. But there's an environment file that Docker uses to read any kind of secrets or any connection strings in there. But there's also additional secrets that we use within Docker secrets to do replacements in the Docker compose file as well, using environment variables and using the secrets. So it's quite a convoluted, complicated setup, but it's required because we don't want to be exposing those things.
And one of the other things that I've been advocating in the talks I've been doing is to add another layer into it, is to encrypt your secrets, even though they're going into some encrypted format.
Yes.
So in .NET Core, all your configuration gets injected via dependency injection by an iConfiguration interface. You can do some bits of magic, trademark, inverted quotes, on the live stream, to then build a bridge class and go and decrypt those values before it hits your actual main code.
Yep. So when we're talking about iConfiguration, this is injected at runtime. But there's also the iOptions as well, which allows you to pull individual sections of your configuration in.
So what iOptions gives you is that you can refer to one part of your configuration, and then you can bind that into a class. And then you can either say, I want the value as it was at startup, I want the current value, or, and this is getting into the whole dependency injection stuff, is you can make it scoped, which means each time a new request comes in, I'll go and look for it. So that way you get over a problem we used to have with web config in framework world, where every time the web config changed, your whole application restarted. Whereas now you can go and change your config file and you just go, okay, I've just received notice it's changed. Next time you ask me, I'll give you the new value.
Or you can force it that you can tell it to rely on a restart depending on your use case. It's highly configurable now. It's not part of the ecosystem, whereas it used to literally reload everything, didn't it? When you change things previously.
Not great if your user's in the middle of a transaction.
No, I don't think I ran into that, but I imagine you would with highly concurrent systems, concurrency systems. We've got a few comments related to config. We've got GeoProgman, who is Jamie, one of our previous guests.
Hello, Jamie.
He said user secrets.NET Core for the win. That was something you said before you were talking about them, I think. And then Volstrat has said, I push config files for basic configuration into our repositories, but I encrypt sensitive data and preferably store those in separate files or registry keys when on Windows. Interesting. I think registry keys are a bit legacy for those kind of things. Not particularly secure, but
now that .NET Core is cross-plat,
yes,
registry keys are a bit Windows-centric.
Yes, they are. I mean, I work with clients that are still kind of on WCF still has its uses, it's still very relevant in some instances, but I've got some clients that essentially have hacked WCF to be a RESTful service, and they haven't moved into the .NET Core world yet. And they are still very Windows dependent. Everything is Windows dependent. I'm actually talking to them about potentially containerizing their environment, and containerizing in something like Docker means that they have to run Docker on Windows, and they don't get the benefits really of doing it. So yeah, there's this old school stuff going on there.
And what's interesting about going into the .NET Core world is you're not just limited to files. I mean, we've touched on command line and environmental variables, but you can go and write your own. It's just a set of interfaces, so you can go and write your own provider. So I've seen instances where people have written SQL Server ones, one over gRPC, which is an interesting take on things.
What's gRPC?
So gRPC is the new REST.
Okay.
So gRPC is, well, it was originally Google Remote Procedure Call, but the G seems to have faded away from Google World now. Okay. But whereas REST and HTTP rely on JSON or XML, now you have a very specific protocol that is much faster. Okay. Mark Gravel talks a lot about it, and it's the big push from Microsoft in .NET Core 3. Interesting.
I've actually just started a project in .NET Core 3 to figure it out.
So certainly, if you've got inter-service calls, rather than everything serialized into JSON and going over HTTP, you can use gRPC, and that basically takes a lot of the noise. Instead of JSON having to say ASCII versions, it just says, this is what the file looks like. So at this position, I'm expecting this field.
Nice. That sounds interesting. So, I'm going to explore that, I think.
Okay. But basically, you can write a configuration source to talk to just about anything, because at the end of the day, it all boils down to key value pairs.
Yeah.
So as long as you can take whatever you are in and come down to key value pairs of strings, you can then serve that up, and the iConfiguration takes care of it all for you.
I remember the days of reading, you mentioned SQL Server there, reading a config table from SQL Server, which was just a key value pair table, with an ID as well. And that being the central source of information for multiple systems. So it's interesting, this gRPC it's a very good use case for that, I imagine.
Yeah. So also, I went to a talk and someone was using GraphQL.
All right, okay.
To query values and then serving it up as a configuration.
I could see that, working even without. Yeah. You could write your own, own bridge class for that, I imagine, without having it built in. But is that something that .NET Core supports natively now, or? No,
you would write your own.
Right.
So basically, configuration in .NET Core centers around two interfaces: iConfiguration source and iConfiguration provider. So iConfiguration source is the thing that goes and talks to whatever you're reading from, be it files, databases, HTTP services. That has a method on it, which is build, and that gives you an iConfiguration provider. Okay. And that's the thing where you turn it into these string key value pairs.
Okay.
And the key is hierarchical, and it's separated by colons. So say you've got a nested, say taking the JSON one, for example, say you've got something that's 3 levels deep, then so A, then B, then C. So it'd be A colon, B colon, C colon, and that is your key to get to the value in there. So as long as you can generate something that gives you that colon delimited hierarchy, that's your provider. Configuration just picks it up from there and goes, yeah, I know what to do with this. And therefore you can use that. But what you can also do is you can start to aggregate different providers.
Okay.
So out the box, .NET Core, when you build a new project, for example, you can start with a JSON file, and then it overrides it with your user secrets. Then it overrides it with the environmental variables. And lastly, it overrides it with command line. Right. And you can aggregate or override to your heart's content.
See, it's interesting. Most of the things that have been put into the recent version of .NET Core, I have done, but I've done them manually, aggregation and overriding variables based on, a hierarchical kind of setup. It's when they become problems that everybody's trying to solve, they start putting them into the framework now, and it's quite nice to see that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so should we talk about the downsides of config files a little bit? I mean, we've touched on a little bit on a few of them.
Yeah.
So, sorry, I think you delayed then a little bit. Your screen's going a bit funny, but we'll...
Yeah, my screen started flickering around a bit.
Okay, so so the downsides of configuration files. Now, as far as I can see it, we've talked about the security implications of putting secure values into a config file. There are also a few times people tend to read values from configs without validating them a lot of the time as well.
Yeah.
And if you've seen that before.
Yeah. And certainly back in Framework, the original version where it assumed that everything was a string, it was up to you to go and convert it into an integer or a Boolean.
Yeah.
And people would just go, convert it to a Boolean with no error handling around it. And your application goes kaboom.
Yeah. I said I've seen that quite a lot. I've also seen people not validate, not just the types, but not validating the actual data that's in there as well. Sometimes it might be an email address that's configurable.
Yeah.
You know, just simple validation helps along the way.
Yeah.
So we talked about committing files as well into source code. That's obviously a problem. It becomes less of a problem if you've got a proper somebody who controls the DevOps process or somebody who controls. If you do accidentally commit as well, there's always the invalidating API keys and changing passwords and things like that. We have to do that.
But those are sort of remedial processes.
Yeah,
it's best not to do in the first place. I mean, It's interesting that GitHub, if you commit something and it spots, oh, this might be a secret, it'll warn you and say, are you sure you want to commit this?
That was actually really interesting. I found that out for the DNI site actually for the first time when I pushed. It was couple of years back now. First time I pushed, I accidentally kept it. It was a test API key, and it actually expired anyway, so I'd forgotten about it. I pushed it, and and I sent an email, and I was really quite impressed that it did that. And it also sends me emails about security notifications as well, which again, that's
GitHub's an interesting thing because I think the thing to think about with all your source code is what if my company was a bit like Microsoft. Everything was closed source, and then suddenly everything was open source. What things am I exposing in the source control?
I think.
Sorry.
No. So I say there was. I was just reading something that Jamie wrote in chat. Then he said that he loves using guard clauses. For this kind of thing to ensure.
Big fan of those. Yeah. And certainly you touched on validation. We touched on having a bridge class earlier. So when we talk about bridge class, what we're saying is something that acts as a go-between. Now, so sometimes you have an adapter pattern where you can't control the interfaces, but bridge class is pretty much the same thing, but you're in control. You can change things as much as you want. So you can intercept stuff on the way. So with configuration, you might have, we've talked about encryption, so having encrypted values, stepping in, decrypting them before they hit the main system. Same with validation. You can sit in the middle and go, is this value not quite right? Can I sort it in my bridge class, or do I need to raise an exception?
And then when you do raise the exception as well, it's handling it appropriately. And making sure that, I don't know, sometimes if you've got some global exception handling, it just gets lost. And you don't see the error, but again, that's up to the developer to determine. That's a whole new show, to be fair. How to handle exceptions.
But one of the other main problems with config files is if you're running a web farm, so you've got 20 servers, unless you've got a continuous deployment system going on, there is the risk that your config files could start to drift apart.
Yes.
So you may have a value, say an API key, and one of those 20 servers doesn't get updated. If someone in the load balanced farm hits that 20th server, they're going to hit a problem.
Yeah. So this is where the centralized kind of database or the gRPC stuff would come in handy.
Yeah.
And again, we would normally, I think if you're running thinking about it though, if you're running a web farm, you've got a load balanced situation, you probably would have a fairly
Yeah.
well-established
Yeah.
process, and it'd probably be
Yeah,
automated.
you would hope so.
I hope so. I mean, I have seen it with people who run 1 or 2 servers in a web farm for DR or you know, more simple scenarios.
Yeah.
DR servers quite often get left out of the mix because they're not automated a lot of the time, or rather they're an afterthought. Yeah.
So, but what was interesting was Michael Feathers, who's known for his book about refactoring code. He put a tweet out back in October saying that along the lines that configuration is just global mutable state.
Yeah, I remember you posting that. Yeah,
and it is right in that, and there was a whole sort of stream, and as I follow it, people were sort of saying, well, if you've got continuous deployment, do you really need configuration files? So if you're doing, but then we come back to where's the line between what goes into source control so that you can do continuous deployment? Does it go into the continuous deployment secrets? And it starts to, and if you've got a whole load of configuration, where do you stop? It starts to unravel a bit.
I think for me, it really depends on the situation. It depends on the company. I've done work with big companies where they didn't want the developers to have any kind of access to any kind of secrets. They didn't have access to any live APIs or even internal APIs, especially not external ones. And even the databases that they queried for integration testing occasionally, in this specific instance, is not normally how integration testing should be done, but they had central servers that were set up in a particular state, and they were just read from. All they did was read operations, and they needed to verify that things worked. But yeah, the configure in that instance, I was actually doing the DevOps work for that, and everything was hidden in secrets. Everything was farmed off to Octopus or Visual Studio. It was Visual Studio Online at the time. I keep getting it wrong because it changes name every 5 minutes. So it was secrets in Azure DevOps. I've had another situation where I was the only developer working on a particular piece of software. I put the DevOps system together in something like GitLab, and I put a gated branching system in there. Everything, all the secrets again were stored as private global variables in the GitLab build. When I came back to do more work, I actually adhered to the rules that I'd put in place, and I didn't have access to the variables because they'd all been changed, and the company was, they were quite big on the security. So it works really well, but it takes a long time to get them kind of setups working and not intrusive and not stopping productivity with developers.
And I think this is where the use of secrets in .NET Core come in really useful, because then as long as you've got a decent mocking system going on, then you can just have some secrets going in and using your bridge to intercept it and so on. As long as you've got something in your unit test that stops calls actually going out to the outside world, you can intercept them and make sure everything goes in and mocks responses back.
Yeah, I say I have to be honest. I haven't used .NET secrets in user secrets in .NET Core yet. It's every time I've needed to do any kind of configuration and it's needed to be secure, it's been in the actual DevOps platform. Or it's been such a simple website that it's been fine to use a server deployed configuration file, which is manual. The DNI website, it's manual. That file, I don't have a DevOps system, but I am working on putting one together. But even then, it will not be in source code, so I need to figure out a way to do that, which will probably end up being some kind of secrets within the actual deployment system, whatever I decide to use. So that's the question then. So does that lead us on to, do we actually need config files, or is it subjective?
I think it is subjective. But in the .NET Core world, where everything is coming through iConfiguration, you could mock all your secrets, or your configuration. So, for example, there's a memory version of the source provider. So while you're doing unit tests and what have you, you can just use the memory provider, which is just a key value dictionary, and pass everything through there for all your unit testing.
Interesting.
So
I've only ever used the iOptions class to. I mean, obviously, I use the iConfiguration class to create it and bind it, but the iOptions class, I only use that as because I want a subset of the values for a particular service class or something. So I only mock that, and it's easy to mock that. You don't need to use a memory class or anything like that.
If you're mock, and this comes on to something that I go through in my talk, in that you can then take it one step further, and the actual class that iOptions then binds your values into, you just mock that. Now, what you can do is in your dependency injection,
I see, right.
You can unwrap the iOptions into just that class. So iOptions, for those who aren't aware, doesn't give you the value just out the box. What you have to do is you either have to say, I want the value if it's the original one, or current value if it's options monitor. So you always have to unwrap to get your value out.
Okay.
If you unwrap it in your dependency injection, then everything you're injecting into just says, I want my settings.
General or whatever.
So if you then extract an interface out of my settings, so you just say my settings, you just mock your my settings. You don't even have to mock iOptions then. What's nice about that is, say you've got several libraries that contribute into your application, you would have to take the NuGet package, the options NuGet package along with you for those libraries. If you've just got a common library with my settings in, you don't have to drag along that NuGet package along to all your other projects.
I mean, that would be more preferable, especially if it's a shared class or something like that. I think I haven't run into any problems with using iOptions, and especially not mocking, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter.
You're just mocking an interface.
Yeah, I don't really care what's in the data in that. The beauty of doing proper TDD is that we don't care what we're mocking.
No.
Even when we get down to we're talking about configuration. I was going to go too far into TDD then, but I think you've given me a lot of food for thought here, especially in .NET Core 3, which is there's some new things in there that I haven't touched on, which I've only this week. Yes, it was the beginning of this week. I started putting together my new company website, and I currently have a web API backend, a .NET Core web API backend, with a Angular front end, and it's completely and wholly inappropriate for my particular website. So what I'm actually doing now is looking at ASP.NET Core 3 MVC, so I can figure out what the changes are. It's not something that I would probably use in a production environment these days, because normally I'm writing line of business applications, but I want to play with it and figure it out. And I think you've given me a lot of things to play around with here, and
cool.
I'm quite looking for. I quite like configuration though. I'm a weird developer. I enjoy doing ETL, for God's sake. I like doing lots of different things, and I don't mind faffing around with code for ages to get it just exactly right as it should be. Okay, so I think we've actually talked about quite a lot of things that we've got in here. Is there anything else in configuration then that you've come across that's worth mentioning?
I think we pretty much covered it all. I'm just scrolling through some notes I made, and I think we've covered it all. I mean, certainly we touched on the bridge class, and I could ramble on for a whole hour about sort of going into the solid principles and using the bridge to take you into solid. But I haven't got another hour now.
No, we've actually got quite a little bit of time, so we can talk about that a little bit, and at least a higher level anyway.
Okay, so I've touched on several of the points there. So when I was talking about getting away from the iOptions, and so your bridge class, what that gives you is single responsibility, because your class is just serving up settings just for one tiny purpose. The L, list cost substitution, because you've got the interface, so you've got polymorphism, you can swap it all in as well. D, dependency version, you're injecting it in. interface segregation, again, by splitting it all out. If you've got your configuration split into, say you've got 20 bit sections across your whole configuration, then if you give each one its own discrete interface, then as far as your application is concerned, you might even have an interface just to say, I want a SQL connection string. That's all I want. I don't care about the rest of it. Just splitting it all out to the smallest bite-sized pieces that you want.
Right. I mean, I'm an advocate for design patterns and solid, and I mean, I don't mind faffing around with code, but do you not think sometimes that the way that modern programming or modern .NET Java programming is going, especially with all of the granularity of it, do you not think sometimes it's overkill for some applications?
Sometimes it is. If you want to get something out there quick and dirty, just a quick transformation of something or something to move a few files, yeah, the quickest, dirtiest way is fine. But if you want something that's going to last for a few years, you want to do TDD, maintainable, new developers coming in, needing to get up to speed with it, then that's where the patterns really come into their own. And yes, you might be writing a lot more boilerplate code to get it like that, but it's maintainable, testable. I'm a big fan of Solid, but that said, I've started moving more into sort of a functional way of thinking, which obviously is a different paradigm to the object-orientated Solid world.
Functional is becoming a lot more popular these days, especially with the advent. Well, I say the advent; it's fairly old now in the .NET world of lambdas.
Yes,
and also I think it's CCMIXTER 2015, the latest one, whatever it is, maybe 2017. That's also got what they call arrow functions, lambdas, built into the language as well, and TypeScript as well. It's becoming very, very common on multi-paradigm languages, in multi-paradigm languages.
And one thing that I've been playing around with lately, I gave my talk up in Sheffield a little while back, and at the same time, Simon Painter was doing a talk about functional C#. And it made me start to think about the way I do things. And one of the things I've said about sort of having an interface, just say, go and get me a SQL connection. So you've got an interface, then you've got a class implementation, and so on. Alternatively, you could just have a Lambda function registered in your DI container. So if you've got a particular signature of a delegate that says get SQL connection, then you just register the delegate in your DI container to go and get that configuration value. And therefore, you don't need an interface, you don't need a class. You've just said, I've got a function. And I think that's where we may be starting to move towards, is this sort of small discrete things, just make functions, rather than a full-on interface class, multiple implementations.
I think what's happened is we've moved towards this object-oriented world in the enterprise because of the enormousness of the projects a lot of the time, and because of the we're wanting to move away from these monoliths that create real big legacy problems, and the problem with introducing the functional paradigm into things like C#, I'm a fan of it, but the problem of introducing it and introducing additional flexibility, such as injecting a lambda instead of injecting classes, or registering services and things like that, is that we run the risk of giving programmers a little bit too much flexibility as well, so they may end up going too far back into that world. But I mean, I'm not too worried, because I think if you've got senior programmers and you've got code reviews and you've got a good ecosystem built into your company, you tend to be able to get the right result from the people that you're empowering, and the developers as well that are doing the work.
As long as no one goes back to using go-tos.
Well, I saw a go-to the other day, in a legitimate go-to in a piece of code. Forgot what it was now. It was probably just a batch file, but it was a build system. It was a build system that I'm looking at for one of my clients, and they've got Perl running one part of the build system, and then they've got batch files, which they call make files, which confused the hell out of me because they were referring to them as makefiles for ages, and they're not makefiles. They're just batch files called makefile. And and the makefiles are just running loads of commands, and there's go-tos everywhere in it. But that part of my job is to actually look at that and go, this needs to be replaced with shiny new DevOps world type thing. You know? It's
a nice bit of PowerShell in there.
Well, I also did a job fairly recently, the last few years, that I wrote about 10,000 odd lines of PowerShell to get a fully integrated application application kind of setup. It was a templating system that created templates from Visual Studio templates, then set up things like all of the Azure DevOps builds, all of the code policies, absolutely everything using PowerShell. So there was so much of it, but it was... I loved it by the end of it, but I wouldn't like to be the person maintaining it now, put it that way. Right, so in terms of configuration, I feel like we've covered a lot there. There's a few other things that we probably haven't touched upon in too much, and it's less to do with the application configuration and more to do with like the configurations that surround the applications.
Okay.
So we talked about Docker a little bit. And that's the deployment. But then we've got things like, I'm assuming with you working in the .NET Core world, you do a fair amount of Linux work these days?
Where I'm at the moment, we're not. We're still very much in a Windows environment. It'd be nice to go to a Linux world because obviously it's cheaper hosting. But at the moment, we're very much in a Windows world.
So, I mean, Linux is typically basically based on configuration files. Everything. As I've moved more into the Linux world with .NET Core, and I've got a lot more experience in the Bash world, it's amazing that the entire operating system runs it, because we're so used to having the registry in Windows, and everything's different. But the configuration files in that instance there's no standards there. There's a lot of variation on how each daemon or application or subsystem uses its configuration files. There's so many different types of formats as well. Have you? There you go. There's a question for you.
Okay.
Have you got a favourite format of config file, and what kind of ones have you? Because we've got JSON, we've got XML.
Yeah, we got JSON. So, I mean, in the talk I give, I spend 5 minutes slagging off web.config and how much I hate the XML version of it.
It's not just the XML though. The XML's fine.
No. It's the schema.
Oh my god, it's especially WCF ones.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, I have seen sort of like 1,000-line web configs where there's about 20 or 30 WCF services being called. Time you've got sort of ASP.NET throwing in its bits, and then you've got some custom config for, say, nlog or something like that that takes up a whole load of lines, and it just goes on. And all it wants is one angle bracket in the wrong place, and your application won't start. And do you think you can find that angle bracket?
And there's not that many tools to help you help you debug that either. But I mean, WCF is particularly bad because as soon as you need to change anything about the default setup, the default bindings, you have to insert a literal ton of XML, and it becomes convoluted and complicated. But like I said, we are in a better world now, I think, with JSON. So back to the config.
Yeah, so certainly, I mean, I'm a big fan of the JSON format.
See, I've recently been working with YAML quite a lot.
I've been doing a lot of stuff with Swagger and tend to use YAML with the Swagger, Open API as it's now called. The YAML format for those.
Yeah, I've been using YAML a little bit, and there was one other one I came across the other week, and I can't for the life of me remember it, but it was apparently quite common, especially in the Linux world. I'm not going to keep going on about it, but I found YAML quite difficult to understand initially, especially because you can override it as well. It's kind of got an inheritance schema, and then there's also the specific implementations, things like Docker Compose. It's got its own way of handling the overrides, and it doesn't work as the YAML schema kind of puts it. It's proprietary in a way.
I mean, what is interesting is when I sort of started first playing around with ASP.NET Core, is there was a flashback to about 1993 when I saw it supported INI files.
Oh, wonderful.
Back to Windows 3.1.
I still see them. I still see them in production, especially with like desktop applications as well.
Yeah. So that was a flashback to when I first started programming with VB3.
I don't think I've ever written an application that uses I also started with VB6 and Classic ASP. Never used created an application that needed an INI file.
Yeah, when I first started programming, I was writing desktop applications, and in VB3 the default was to use INI files.
Do you see any limitations with you said JSON's your favorite at the moment then? So do you see any limitations with JSON?
Only in terms of sort of making sure your curly brackets are all sort of lining up, and so sometimes you have to be careful with escaping certain bits. But generally, you can load it into something like Notepad++, and you can spot an error quite easily. The only trouble is you're still indenting a lot, and you could get down into quite a long down hierarchy.
I think there's a decent amount of tools out there for, again, debugging JSON, and it's fairly simple and fairly easy to follow. There's not that many kind of data types in JSON, but that also is almost its downfall. Numbers are just numbers.
Yes.
There's no deviation between a decimal or an integer or a... They're all the same thing. I know what decimal will have a point in it, but JSON doesn't recognize that as anything other than a number. The same goes for dates as well. Dates are there's actually some limitations in dates, and it's something to do with the time zones. I can't quite remember, but you have to specify a time zone in JSON if you're using proper, you're passing it over certainly a RESTful service.
Going back round to having your bridge class as the interceptor, in the demo I give, I show it. I gather some times, and rather than having to specify a full time format, I just express the time as you normally would have hour : minute, and let my bridge class take it from that string format into a timestamp.
Well,
a time span. Sorry.
.NET Core is particularly good at time and date conversions. Or .NET in general, I think, is particularly good at that. So and learning which data type to use is another skill as well. There isn't a GUID or a unique identifier data type in JSON either as well, which sometimes causes problems for formatting. But again, it's not the end of the world. It's just a string that you can convert and test, validate, as we said at the beginning of the show. Okay. Right, so let's I think we should close the show now.
Okay.
Unless there's anything particularly that you wanted to mention that you've...
No, I think we've covered configuration.
We have,
all the way round.
There is it's one of them things that not every developer understands, and I think it's a key. You get to a certain point where when you understand what configuration's for and why it's useful and why we have to take these variables out of our source code and put them into config or into CI/CD systems, I think it makes you a better developer. It did me anyway when I figured it out. It's a long time back now, but when I figured it out, it made me realize that it's not just me that's developing. Other people need to, and this you know what, we didn't talk about how to identify what the config value is and what isn't. Why would you put something in a config file? Why, I know we've talked about connection strings, things that change, but are there scenarios where you think config is used in overkill? Have you seen any examples of a value that's been put into config that doesn't change that you think probably shouldn't be there?
I think feature switches are an example where it comes down to how mature your CD system is, because you could say, okay, what I'll do is I'll just have a hard-coded class of my feature switches. I'll just go and change the source code for that, go and push out a new version, your feature switches are in place. So that may be one example where just having them out in a config file, because you're going to use your CD system to go and push your config file out anyway, so you might as well just push your application. I think with that, it comes down to application downtime. Because if you can't afford for your application to come down, unless you got a system where you can go and swap from one pool of load balance servers to another pool. So if you can't have any application downtime, that's where config files come into their own in .NET Core world, because you don't have to restart your application. You can just say, okay, I'll just go and push out my new config files, and it will just pick them up.
Right. Okay, fair enough. I said I've come across a few instances where config has been used in overkill. I've actually seen people use config for things like email templates, and which should be separate files, really, which are config in a way.
Certainly, I haven't come across that.
So that, you know, if you've got an email template where you need to send, you've got a system that sends out different types of emails. Normally, what you would do is have separate, have separate JSON files for the data in those emails, and another, like a HTML file or some kind of markup file that has for the layout. But yeah, I've actually seen people that have put all of the data within. I mean, it was XML, you know, it was web config days, but used basically a custom schema that they set up, a custom config schema that had all of the and that's overkill. You need to segregate that.
I wouldn't even conceive that.
But there are times when we're not sure. You know, there are times when we there is, for example, let's take email again. We've got an email where the from address of an email is always going to be the same. It's never going to change across systems or anything like that. Should that be config, or should that be hard coded?
I think with that, I've seen examples of both. And I think it always comes back down to, if it's only going to change once in a blue moon, you may as well hard code it, but put it in its own file where it's a constant, so you've only got it in one place. Because the other problem is having it littered throughout your code base, and then you've got to do a search and replace.
Yeah, absolutely.
Across your whole project. So as long as it's set up as a constant, so I don't have a problem with that.
Do you I mean, we both use constant classes, you know, that have got just basically a list of variables. Would you consider that config in any way, shape, and form, or is that an entirely different paradigm?
I think it is config. It's just not in your usual paradigm of config.
But it's not mutable config. It's immutable
immutable.
It's only mutable when we change the actual compilation, you know, when we recompile, which isn't config then at that instance. So we're getting into specifics here, but I just the things keep popping into my head, and I'm like, well, what actually, you know, when I think about config, it's all about, you make decisions every day, lots of decisions when you're programming, and sometimes they're wrong. You know, we're not all perfect, and we all make mistakes, and we learn from them. This is why when we look at code that we wrote 2 years ago or 10 years ago, we look at it and go, God, I was an idiot back then.
Well, there's I don't know whether it's his, but quite often on .NET Rocks, Richard Campbell says, only two people knew what I was thinking when I wrote this code, God and me. Now God only knows what I was thinking.
Right, okay, so let's close the show then. We have done enough config talking, I think. So we have a section at the end of the show called Bring Your Own Manual. We used to have an RTFM, which was a whinge about something that we'd done in the week, but now Bring Your Own Manual is a learning experience. So what have we learned this week? And I'm going to let you go first, Steve. Have you learned anything new? It doesn't have to be technical. Could be about people. It could be anything.
I flipped a coin, and I had a geeky one and a non-geeky one. So I'm going to go for the non-geeky one.
Okay.
This week I learnt that the makers of Smarties and M&Ms became best friends during the Spanish Civil War, and they had a gentleman's agreement not to compete against each other, and that's why M&Ms didn't appear in the UK until the 1980s. They were actually around from the 1940s in America.
Right. Well, I wasn't around then, so I didn't know that actually happened. But that's an interesting fact. Very interesting. Good stuff. Right. So mine. I prepared this last week because I had two last week, but I forgot to refine it a little bit further. So sorry if this is not the best of BYOMs, but I learned that most people, most of my clients at least, don't know what they're selling. They haven't got a clue what their products are, or they do have a clue, but they can't define them in a short sentence. They don't have a vision for their product, and they don't have a description for their product. And whenever I speak to them, this usually the number one thing that I try and figure out is, what is it you sell? What is it that you want your customers to buy? What's unique about it? As I get more senior and I realize kind of more that there's a world outside of code, and I do a lot more process driven stuff, these questions come up a lot more, and I have to help them realize that. And a lot of the time it's about the way that I ask questions and the way that I challenge them, I suppose. Maybe some of them, I'm sure, don't like it, but I'm sure some of them do. But yeah, it's amazing. A lot of the time people don't know what they're selling, or don't know fully how they're actually, what market they're kind of serving. And sometimes they need to figure that out before you can actually figure out everything else underneath it, such as how are the developers, how are they going to develop? How are you going to develop your Jira instance? How are you going to set up your user stories and your features and your epics, and how do they relate to the actual business that you're serving as a company? And a lot of people, especially those that are trying to move from a waterfall world into a more agile and scrum world, which, it's still happening. Yes, there are still companies out there that are trying to do this and don't fully understand and realize the benefits of the scrum world and the agile world. That's the number one thing, is that they need to realize what they're trying to sell in order to, get the work done in a more efficient way. Not particularly interesting. Not as interesting as your fact anyway, Steve.
But then aren't we all software companies now? What we actually sell, that's the argument about banks and lots of these financial institutions. They're just big software companies now.
Yeah. Most businesses these days have some element of software in them. I made the right career choice. we did, didn't we?
We did, yeah.
I actually had a client a few years ago, or a potential client, who made me worry about my job for the first time ever, made me worry about, is programming actually going to be around forever? Because I've always thought that, the more we get into it, there's always going to be someone who needs to write the computers. Apparently they've developed an AI that works alongside the developer and does most of the boilerplate and most of the... And I didn't get involved, so I don't know how far it went, but when they explained it to me, it was like, that's doing a lot of the things that I do on my day-to-day job.
Well, there's even AI built into Visual Studio 2019 now.
Well, AI's everywhere, but there's different levels of AI as well. And
yeah, I think you're going to type this next.
Yeah. Josie's been showing off her Google Home or Alexa or whatever she's got. I'm a tinfoil hat guy with those kind of
things. Same here.
I was all about writing my own home automation system a few years ago. I started playing around with Node.js and started going, right, I'll write it from scratch and I'll turn all the lights on. And I was like, you know what? Actually, this is probably not a good thing. I don't want it to control my heating and everything else that goes with it. Okay, right. We are now at the end of the show, so you do now get a chance to pimp yourself if you've got any side projects or business or anything else you want to talk about. So feel free.
Okay, so I've mentioned a couple of times that I give a talk about configuration. I've done it at various .NET user groups. So if any user groups are interested in having me come along, you can get in touch with me via Steve Talks Code on Twitter. I've got a blog site, stevetalkscode.co.uk. And if you want to see a video of it, I gave it at .NET Chef. If you go and look on YouTube for .NET Chef, config is easy. You should find it there.
Okay, good stuff. And yes, thanks to everybody in chat. There's been, I think Jamie and Volstrat have been having a good old natter between themselves. It's a bit too much for me to read out during the show, but thank you very much for that, guys. And our time for our pimpage. So you can visit our website on www.dnistream.live, where you find all the links to all of our podcasts, previous and this one. This one will probably be published tomorrow, as always. You can use the website to get into our Discord. You can use it to get onto our YouTube and basically everywhere and everything. We are updating it. It's a bit broken at the moment. Sorry about the show listing page. It doesn't. There's some caching problem with our fireside things. So I know how to solve it. I just haven't had the time to solve it. I will get onto it at some point.
It's not a configuration issue, is it?
It's not. It's actually it's fully a caching issue. It's if I basically occasionally, and I think it's a load balancing issue on their side. Occasionally, I get either a 1 byte response or a 0 byte response from their REST API. And I've told the developer, and he's like, "There's only you and 2 other people that use it, so I'm not going to fix it." And oh well, we actually bought the service because. But anyway, it is what it is, and I need to cache the results when they're available, so so they will be available at all times. So yes, you can use the contact form to get in touch with us, send us a funny dev story, or be a guest on the show if you want. And that's it. All that's left to say goodbye. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you, Chris.
And thank you very much, everybody in chat.
Right.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.